Okay, I think with all of that said, we can move on to our best picture movie series to the year 1965,
Where the
where we are
hills were
talking about
alive.
The Sound of Music. This is a film that won Best Picture over Dr. Zhivago, Darling, Ship of Fools, A Thousand Clowns. Have you seen any of those other films, Brendan?
I've seen Dr. Zhivago. It's
Yes.
been a while since I've seen it, but I've definitely seen it. I
Yeah,
can't say I've seen the rest.
I am with you. I have not seen those other three. So it's hard for me to say how good of a year 1965 was on the whole, at least
Hmm.
with those five films as a microcosm of that year.
Yeah, it's not like what we had to say a week ago when My Fair Lady won Best Picture over Doctor Strangelove or Mary Poppins, to say the least.
Yeah. Which also starred one Julie Andrews, who is, of
Yeah.
course, at the center of The Sound of Music. So, as we talk about The Sound of Music specifically, let's first talk about our history with it. When were you introduced to the film? I presume you've seen it once or twice over the years.
Probably more like 7 times, I think I've
Yeah.
seen this movie. This is another one of those. So, for a little bit of inside baseball for those tuning in, if you listened to our My Fair Lady episode last week, I mentioned how I thought I had seen that movie before, but
Yeah.
so much of it I didn't remember as we did that rewatch for that particular review. That must have been one of those movies I watched with my aunt growing up when I was a really young kid. Going to visit her up
Mhm.
in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. She had a lot of old movies in her collection. A lot of them were classic musicals, and My Fair Lady must have been one of them. The Sound of Music was definitely one of them. And I
Mm.
know I saw that at a very young age, but it's one that stuck. It's one that always stuck with me as a childhood favorite.
Yeah.
It's one that we always watch together. My family loves this movie. So this is one that actually did stay with me, unlike My Fair Lady,
Yeah.
which maybe I didn't even watch My Fair Lady. Maybe I just saw the DVD or the VHS in her collection and assumed that I must have seen it because it just had a very iconic sort of poster
Yeah.
to it. So it could
Yeah.
have just been one
Perhaps.
of those situations. And maybe it was ultimately a first time watch for me when we did that review last week. But no, The Sound of Music, I've got a lot of history with
Mm.
this movie. I've never seen a stage production of it, nor have
Yeah.
I,
Same.
nor have I seen any of the other stories about the Von Trapp family. That I know that there are a few Austrian and German films made about them as well. Really, my only connection to this story is this particular film.
Yeah, no, I am completely with you in that regard. I had seen this film when I was young. I've talked on the show a couple of times how access was limited for me when I was younger because my parents weren't really into movies. We didn't really have much
Hmm.
growing up.
Yeah.
So, as far as becoming a cinephile and movies becoming a big part of my identity, that mostly didn't come until high school and later on into college for me. The Sound of Music, though, was one of those iconic movies that I did get access to because my mom
Hmm.
was a big fan. Funny enough, also big on Mary Poppins. Maybe she just loved Julie Andrews. I don't know. But
A
Mary
lot of people did.
Poppins,
A lot of people did.
yeah, of course, it's hard not to fall in love with her. Mary Poppins was more prominent in our household, but
Hmm. Hmm.
we absolutely did see The Sound of Music. And then I did catch up with it again sometime in college. That was the last time I had seen it.
Okay.
So it'd been a while. It had been nearly a few decades between this viewing and my last viewing when I was in
Okay.
college. So I was
Okay.
very excited to catch up with The Sound of Music once again. And I do love having those experiences, even though you've seen the film a couple of times, you know what to expect, you know the music, you know the imagery. But when you're away from it for 20 ish years,
Yeah. You get some perspective. Sometimes it's
you
good
yeah, it
perspective.
there's a new perspective, there's things about the film that you forgot about, and it is this really interesting, almost new experience in some ways, which is always really fun.
Yeah.
And you couple that with other context we're about to get into, and oh boy, The Sound of Music. It's what a movie. All right, let's jump into this.
Okay. Okay.
Um, The Sound of Music. It is directed by one Robert Wise. And it stars Julie Andrews, Christopher Plummer, Richard Hayden, Peggy Wood, Chairman Carr, Eleanor Parker, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. Nicholas Hammond, Heather Menzies, Dwayne Chase, all part of the Von Trapp family, Angela Cartwright as well. If you are not familiar with The Sound of Music, and forgive me because I'm trying to pull up my notes as we talk here, it is about a young novice who is sent by her convent in 1930s Austria to become a governess to the 7 children of a widowed naval officer. All right, Brendan, what say you about The Sound of Music?
You know, we often talk about doing these movie series and how sometimes a film can shift for you. Sometimes it gets better, sometimes it gets worse when you actually do them in such a tight order with each other. You see these movies in such close proximity with one another, especially if it's a director's work. And, you know, coming off the heels of some of these movies in this series, maybe that has something to do with my response of The Sound of Music now. This was always a childhood favorite of mine, much like West Side Story, also directed by Robert Wise. So we should point out Robert Wise making his second appearance in this 1960s Best Picture winning series. I was always more fond of The Sound of Music. I think it was just the color of it, the energy of it certainly spoke more to my childhood mind. And it is, at this point now, of the two, it is the one I still slightly prefer. I still quite love this film. I did like it a little bit more on this rewatch. I'm not sure if it's the film that's aging well or just simply watching it right after My Fair Lady, because there was nowhere to go but up after that.
Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking it's the latter. And that's not a knock on The Sound of Music. I think it's doing a lot of wondrous things that we'll certainly talk about. Robert Wise is just one hell of a director. We talked about this with West Side Story, and he brings some of those same sensibilities once again to The Sound of Music.
Yeah.
If anything, I think The Sound of Music has maybe my favorite opening shot from any movie musical.
Oh my God. Yeah. Unquestioned.
Maybe the only other rival I can think of is the opening credits for The Umbrellas of Cherbourg and the use of the actual umbrellas. A very different kind of opening scene, but I think that's maybe the only other rival I can think of offhand. What I love so much about
and forget about quality, just in terms of iconicness.
Oh yeah, the scope
if anything
of it
touches The Sound of Music in that regard.
It's not even just the beauty of the Austrian Alps that it's capturing, but it's how it transitions from cold and brooding snowy landscapes to the beautiful green hills, which just feels so effortless. And it's
then
also
right into that song.
Yeah,
that opening number.
I love that transition. I love how it sweeps into it. So the technique of it is really cool. But in doing so, in transitioning from, you know, that cold and brooding sensibility to something more playful and light and fun and beautiful, kind of suggests these two emotional extremes kind of battling each other, which this film very much represents. This is at times maybe the schmaltziest movie I've ever seen, especially in its depiction of music as a savior of sorts. And it's not until it reaches its final act when it becomes something else entirely. And those same songs that brought so much optimism no longer have the same meaning. And I think that transition is really effective. I've always found the journey quite emotionally stirring and also kind of wonderfully romantic. There are a lot of other things that we can talk about. I'm really curious to see what you think about it, given this rewatch. I quite love this film, but I know not a lot of people do. I know it has a bit of a, I don't want to call it a divisive reaction nowadays, but it's not as revered as some of the other Best Picture winners of these decades that we're talking about. So I certainly understand that, but I do quite love this one.
I think those people are out of their goddamn minds.
Good answer. Good answer. Good answer, my man.
Extraordinarily well. It is 2025 after all. I don't know if the context of the current situation that we are in has anything to do with this or not. I never thought that having an anti-Nazi stance would give this film some extra weight, but here we are in 2025, and Captain Von Trapp ripping a Nazi flag has somehow become a war cry in recent years. incredible, absolutely incredible. But that is certainly, you can't help but think about that when you watch this film through that specific lens.
Oh yeah,
But
the Nazi stuff.
that aside, the music, as we noted, utterly iconic. It is phenomenal how so much of this soundtrack infiltrated the zeitgeist. Even people who haven't seen this film know these songs exceptionally well. They're some of the most
Yeah.
famous musical numbers ever put to film, and for good reason. They are sensational. Julie Andrews, following up her stunning Best Actress winning performance in Mary Poppins with what she does here, has to be one of the very best back-to-back performances of all time. She is once again mesmerizing in this film, as is Christopher Plummer. I love their dynamic in this film. As simple and predictive, or even to Brendan's point, as schmaltzy as it might be at times, the way their stubbornness clashes early on is a lot of fun. And when that begins to fizzle away, it is endlessly charming, and the romanticism comes alive, much like the hills at the beginning of the film. And I love how it's the literal sound of music that changes everything for them. A simple reminder of the power of a song is all that it took for Captain Van Trop, and how that is ciphered through his children. You can see his cynicism evaporate in real time as the camera closes in on Plummer. It is a brilliant moment of performance that I absolutely loved. As I noted, I haven't seen the film in 2 decades, and while I remembered much of the film, I was grinning ear to ear as if I was seeing this for the first time all over again.
Those small moments in between.
There is something magical about its sensational craft and how they unify to tell a very moving story about love and family and resilience in the face of adversity.
Yeah.
Maybe the context of 2025 does amplify that to some degree.
Sure.
I don't know. But when I watched this over the weekend, I did have a borderline transcendent experience with this. I absolutely
I'm
adored
glad
it.
to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. I love this
loved
movie.
every second of it.
You know, it's interesting to talk about the chemistry between Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer, especially given that apparently Christopher Plummer admitted to not having the
I know,
best
he
time
hated
working.
making this.
But I believe that they remain pretty close friends up until his death.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of, lovely irony, to say the least. But they do have really good chemistry because there's a journey to go on beyond just the romantic kinship between the two of them. That's something I took notice of, was how their romance is not immediate. It really does take its time and allows this film's nearly 3-hour runtime to justify its length. Captain Von Trapp has to learn to love himself and his children first before learning to love Maria, and receiving that kind of love that she has to give in the first place, and the joy that she brings, the looseness that she brings that's beneficial to a child's life, something that Von Trapp has failed to instill on his kids, given the passing of the mother of their mother, his previous wife.
Yeah.
He treats them like employees, essentially. He runs it like he would a Navy captain. So there's a bit of a psychological edge to it, and how people who are in mourning tend to bring their work home with them. They can't. They need it as that distraction. And Christopher Plummer in his performance, he has to learn to love himself first, which is what makes the romance between Maria and George, I believe his name is. That's why I think works so well. There's a gradual build to it. It actually takes its time. It's like an escalator as opposed to an immediate lustful attraction, if you will. And I love movies that do that justify the runtime for it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, that's why the music here is so incredible. One of the best things about it is how the music really does become the nucleus of this story on a deeper level, not just on the surface, how it becomes a diverting part of the film, but in equal parts, it serves as an act of defiance against the Nazi regime, who are
Hmm.
trying to force Captain Von Trapp into the Nazi Navy. And
Yeah.
the family uses music as a means to fight back against an ideology they oppose, but it's also something Maria uses defiantly against Captain Von Trapp and his initial orders because
Hmm.
she knows the power it has emotionally. It's something that chisels through the grief of the Von Trapps, especially the
Yeah.
captain. And as a result, Maria's disobedience directly leads to healing and joy for the Von Trapp family, which not only changes them and brings them closer together, but reveals to Maria that this really is her calling. This is what brings meaning to her life. And I cannot emphasize enough how good Julie Andrews is here and how she taps into that
She's
with her
wonderful.
performance.
She's
She
wonderful.
understands intimately how music defines Maria. And when she has that realization, it is such a magical moment in this film. It really, really is
Um,
incredible. And
yeah.
how that tethers to what you're saying as far as the captain, how he has to learn to love himself. Again, I mentioned it in my opening thoughts, but to reiterate it once again, that specific moment when he has that epiphany, how it is ciphered through music, it is simple filmmaking in some degree, but
But it's
the
earnest.
performance, it's earnest, it's
Yeah.
sincere. It's absolutely incredible.
This movie is the pushback against any criticism for a movie being too schmaltzy, where schmaltz is strictly used as a negative. Movies can be schmaltzy in the right ways. This is an
Yeah.
example of a movie that utilizes that type of sentiment to its advantage. A lot of it is because of how earnest that it is.
Yeah.
Performatively, the filmmaking, as we talked about, Robert Wise just on another level with the way he
Oh my
crafts these
gosh.
musicals. And this it's one of the most gorgeous looking movies I've ever seen, if I'm being honest. And I'm with you. I love Julie Andrews' performance. The way she portrays Maria as someone that's essentially out of place in this convent. She thinks that she's ready for this life merely because it was something she found beautiful as a child, kind of naively, and that her upbringing seemed to suggest that this is something she was supposed to do. It was all about this sort of social structure in a way.
Mhm.
So she's utilizing music as a way of pushing back against that structure. Things like organized religion or really strict parenting and strict upbringing. It's meant to push back against that, which is where the Nazi symbolism then comes into play in the final act.
Yeah.
I find that interesting because apparently the real life Maria von Trapp actually said that wasn't really true for her. She actually did want to become a nun. She truly did, and actually had some regrets that it didn't go that way for her. But this is kind of a loose, fictionalized
Of
depiction
course.
of
Yeah.
that, which again, that's fair. I know that because of that, the movie was a bit criticized in both Germany and Austria for not portraying the Von Trapps as accurately, but they had their own movies that did that. This is more of a
Yeah.
reflection of how Americans and other neighboring cultures can understand their story, at least the thematic context of their story, and really what it meant for Austria to be so unfairly seized by Nazi Germany and as rapidly as
Yes.
they were. It kind of speaks to how Austria as a nation has remained so consistent over the years. A lot of people say that it's a land that feels lost in time because
Mhm.
they feel so like appreciative of that culture. So to have something like this happen, it makes that historical outcome all the more devastating, which is why I think everything in the final act is really effective.
I agree. And I think it gives credence to that schmaltziness that you're talking about. It sounds like cliche wall art, but
Hmm.
at the heart of this film, it is about love and family and standing up for what is right. And the history of humanity suggests those things will always be relevant. That is the
Hmm.
story of humankind. There will always be some sort of tyrant trying to gain power over everything. And there comes a moment where you have to draw lines in the sand, even if that comes at great risk and personal consequence. In the case of The Sound of Music, it might be a wealthy white family at the center of it. And maybe that doesn't register with everybody. But the
Sure.
Von Trapps leaving their giant mansion behind to
Mhm.
flee into the unknown, I do think is great symbolism, especially when you consider how close they were to Nazism. It's not as if the
Yeah.
Nazis are distant villains here. They're friends of the Von Trapps, they're neighbors. There's, of course, Liesel's love interest getting swept up in
Yeah.
Nazi ideology, making it personal and
Yeah.
close to home, amplifying their choice in the end to avoid complacency for the sake of comfort.
Yeah.
And in the
That
middle of that, the film highlights how art and music can become acts of defiance, as I noted earlier, something that is historically vital with how it counteracts propaganda. So the music at
Mhm.
the core of this film isn't just catchy and diverting. There is a thematic underbelly to it as well that again gives credence to the schmaltziness that we do see here because it does speak to something that foundationally is the story of humankind. And
Yeah.
again, you cannot help but draw the parallels to 2025 with Nazism as prominent as it is in our society. Crazy that those words are coming out of my mouth, but that is the truth and the reality in which we live. I would like to hope that this film would be less relevant in another 100 years, but
Well,
I don't know
I
if
don't
that'll
know.
ever be the case. So, as lovable and as affable and charming as this film is on the surface, I really do think when you dig beneath that veneer a little bit, there actually is something more to this
It's
film
a very
as
substance
it
movie.
relates
Yeah, there's a
to
lot of substance
avoiding
here.
complacency.
There's a lot
Yeah.
of substance here, and I think one of the things the film does really well too is it doesn't hold your hand as it portrays the political ramifications of Austria being taken over by Nazi Germany. Because
Yeah.
to your point, there are people in Austria that see this as a celebration, a good thing. So essentially, by the end of this movie, Austria is a divided nation.
Yeah.
And to say a nation divided is not a relevant thing. That means you're not watching the news nearly enough. So,
I don't know if you've been on Twitter lately or not, but
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
little divided at
It's
the
it's a
moment.
little it's a little at each other's throats. But that's
Yeah.
essentially what happens to Austria here. It just so happens that the Von Trapps wanted nothing to do with it, and they were being and he uh, being this captain, being forced into this situation as a Navy captain, he also wanted nothing to do with it. So they took matters into their own hands. I think historically, it's kind of interesting that their actual home that they ended up fleeing, I think, was taken over by one of Hitler's right-hand mans, if I'm not mistaken, which is kind of devastating to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there is a level of devastation that the movie is getting at in its final act, and I love the way it utilizes those same songs that we love so much at the beginning, but they become about something different. They become sort of a not a battle cry, but a cry for something else entirely. They take on new meaning. Even though
Yeah.
they're the same songs, the melodies haven't changed, the lyrics haven't changed, but when you hear Von Trapp himself singing a line like "Bless my homeland forever," it means something entirely different in that final
Yes.
act than it did, an hour and a half
100%.
ago.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I do love the backdrop of this film and how it depicts this family avoiding that complacency. It would have been real easy to simply linger in those comforts. They have this giant mansion, they
Mhm.
have any sort of help that they need. It could not be better of a life for this family.
Mhm.
And if they simply conceded to Nazism and he went to work for the Nazi Navy, everything would have been fine. They could have lived in comfort, but they would have had to reckon with those choices morally and ethically. And I do love how, to your point, the film doesn't hold your hand through any of that. We
Mhm.
just simply see these characters react to something that they vehemently oppose, especially
Yeah.
Captain Von Trapp. And he makes a decision. We're
Yeah.
leaving all of this behind. We're going into the unknown. Who knows? Our lives on the other side will likely be completely different than this.
Yeah.
And that's a bold choice, especially when you have 7 children,
Yeah.
and a brand new wife. And like that does carry weight. And again, it's hard to separate it from the times that we're living in now. So maybe that is a little biased from my perspective. I don't know. But when I'm watching this over the weekend, I did feel that. And when he sings that song at the end that you're talking about, how that is recontextualized, it's fan-freaking-tastic. Another moment that stands out to me in a similar regard is when they're hiding behind the statue there at the end. And the little one asks Maria, because it's been established that when you're not feeling your best, what are you seeing? You're seeing, these are my favorite things. That's what brings me joy. That's what helps me cope. And she says, is this where we sing my favorite things? And you see Julie Andrews with every ounce of desperation and urgency, but quiet and subtle, because they are hiding after all, simply say to her, now is not the time. Now we do not.
But she has to do it in a way
things.
that's also a lesson to a young child for her to
Yes.
understand that. All of a sudden, her motherly instincts are tapping into that too.
Yes. It's phenomenal. Like it's such an incredible moment that juxtaposes how it was taught earlier, but the circumstances provoke nuance that, as what, a 3-year-old she is in that moment, she's not going to understand those nuances.
That's why the movie does feel perhaps a bit schmaltzy and cutesy, is because it is trying to speak from the perspective of a child in some scenes. I think that's why I love some of the early scenes with Maria and the children, especially when she's first introduced to them. They take a pretty immediate liking to her. And when I say immediate, I mean like 5 or 10 minutes. They're at first pretty dismissive of her, like they've been with any other governess that they've had to deal with.
Yeah.
But when you get to that dinner scene, which happens pretty quickly after the whole pine cone incident that happens,
Yeah.
they take a pretty immediate liking to Maria, because she does something that I never really noticed up until this rewatch, is that these children are probably used to having a governess-like figure stand up to them, but not someone that stands up for them like she does. That's why they start immediately crying at the dinner table, right? Because they don't really know how to recognize this level of compassion. And I never really picked up on that at first, but rewatching it again, there are little touches like that where no one child or even character comes out and says, you did this for us. You were the first to do this, and we love you for it. You just kind of go along with the emotional storytelling at hand. It's really smartly done.
No, it's incredible. And that makes a lot of sense because, as you noted earlier, their routine with their father is extremely strict. It's all routine. He blows the whistle. You are a soldier in that house.
Yeah.
There's no childhood to be had. And Maria comes in and wants to completely disrupt that, which again, going back to how she's disobedient herself toward the captain. And that creates some incredible conflict between them that is quite electric at times. And I do love that. But she wants these children to be children.
Yeah.
And boy, oh boy, if there is a theme in art that registers with me more than anything else, it probably is that. Citizen Kane is my favorite film of all time for those reasons.
Sometimes being a kid is so cool.
It's the best. It is the absolute best. And she just wants those kids to be kids and showing them compassion and coming to their level instead of trying to stand above them, to your point. Yeah, of course, that's something they've never experienced. It's very indicative with the visual storytelling and the performances. And that's, again, one element of the film that maybe doesn't get enough credit is that it's not spoon feeding. I mean, this is a film that is romantic. It is schmaltzy, but it isn't spoon feeding. Like, there is a lot of visual storytelling that is going on here. And of course, much of it is channeled through the music itself as some sort of thematic tool alongside of it being a narrative one.
Yeah, this is basically the best live action Disney movie not distributed by Walt Disney.
Yeah.
But it does carry some of
I'm sure
those
Disney
same
was proud of it though.
Oh,
I'm
but
sure he loved it.
it does carry some of the usual Disney tropes, some of the same DNA, if you will. Like
Yeah.
it is kind of reminiscent of the childlike wonder of, let's say, a movie like Old Yeller, which is a very different kind of movie, but it does have a similar sort of level of sophisticated innocence. Is the only way I can
Yeah.
put it. But even like this movie, The Sound of Music, does have a schmaltziness to it, but it is very sophisticated.
Mhm.
And that's the thing I think often gets overlooked, because this is a movie that apparently did get pretty mixed reviews when it came out from critics, even though it would go on to win Best Picture. I think a lot of critics at the time called out its sugariness, its sweetness, as perhaps a negative. And this era, the 1960s, we were getting great movies like Doctor Strangelove or even My Fair Lady, which again, not a great movie, but it does have a level of darkness to it and a little bit of cynicism to it comparatively to something like this. Maybe these people were just more used to that. So for something like this to come around, perhaps the response is, oh, this feels like backpedaling. Like we're above this now. I don't know. There's a time and place for this kind of schmaltz if done right. There absolutely is, and this one does it right.
No, absolutely. And even if critics were mixed on it at the time, I do think, ironically, time has been beneficial to this film
Mhm,
because those sophistications, I think, have come to the surface. Again, going back to the poetry that I noted earlier of history repeating itself and the
mhm,
story of humankind always having something to fight against. We have seen that over and over and over and over again over the years. It is
mhm.
very close to home right now, even here in the United States. And then look, in 1965, they had no idea that all these years later, that would be the case.
Sure.
But uh, it's one of those things where they got it right. They got it right at the time. And look, if Dr. Zhivago had gone on to win, that would have been a great winner as well.
I like
But
that movie. I need to watch it again. I remember finding that one being a bit too. I feel like, unlike The Sound of Music, I felt the length with Doctor Zhivago.
yeah, sure, it is really long. No, I
Yeah,
agree.
but I think by compare, isn't it only maybe 20 minutes longer than The Sound of Music?
Something like that. I do think you feel the length of that film much more than The Sound of
Y-
Music, but I
You
haven't seen
do.
Zhivago in a while.
You do.
Uh, yeah,
But again, it gets to that point that the length of a movie itself is not the problem. It's what the movie utilizes with that length and how it tells a story around that, if it justifies that length
yeah,
or not, whether it be too long or even too short. The Sound of Music at nearly 3 hours is a breeze. It's an absolute breeze
yeah.
for me. I don't think there's any wasted space. There are sequences that go on pretty long, but it's the
Mhm.
right kind of moments that take their time for this romance, especially to blossom when it does. Like I said, it actually does take its time.
Mhm.
These characters have to learn to love other things before loving each other, which I love about that. Captain Von
Yeah,
Trapp has to learn to love himself, then he has to learn to love his kids again, and then he learns to love Maria. Yeah,
no,
and I love that journey, and Maria goes through something similar too.
no, I agree. And circling it back to, because I don't want to lose my train of thought on what we were talking about a moment ago, as far as
Mhm,
the history of this film, the context of it, and its schmaltziness, because this isn't the first time in the Academy's history where they've voted for a film to win Best Picture that had those sensibilities to it.
sure.
I mean, we talked about Mrs. Miniver, 1942, when we started this
Yeah,
series last year. The ending of that film, I mean, give me a break. I
that
mean,
is
come
one of the
on.
most unintentionally hilarious endings I think I've seen in a Best Picture winner.
Like it's crazy. We haven't got to the 50s yet, but An American in Paris has a lot of similar sensibilities as
Oh,
well.
true, true.
You could argue a little bit of Marty. I love Marty a lot, but it has similar qualities
Fair.
as The Sound of Music in that regard. So it's not as if this would have been new for the Academy at all. To your point, though, maybe critics did feel as if we've moved beyond that, but that's not
Felt like
how the Academy usually works, though.
No, no, the Academy is very unpredictable. Critically, I feel like maybe they were responding to the fact that the '60s presented maybe a new wave of American filmmaking that would then become even more noticeable in the late '60s into the early '70s. And I think we were getting glimpses of that in the '60s, and The Sound of Music just wasn't in that same
Yeah.
company, I guess. Which again, like,
Well,
just speaks to the timing of it.
yeah, and again, I think the irony of that is through hindsight, The Sound of Music, I would argue anyway, I think it is a compliment to that wave.
Oh, I don't disagree. I think given the conversation we had here, there is a sophistication to this movie that does reveal
really
different
is.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a sophistication to it. And not only that, you think about the technical craft at work here, the sweeping camera work, the use of the hills, the shooting in Austria. They did shoot this in certain places in Austria. The craft, the production design. I mean, we talked about this with My Fair Lady last week. Really, the only good elements of that film are its craft, and the costumes are really great. Some of the camera work is fantastic, but The Sound of Music blows that film out of the water. Out of the water.
We should really do a Robert Wise movie series.
Yeah, I would be down for that. He actually has. I mean, we've talked about his musicals because they're the ones that won Best Picture here, at least of recent. But he actually has more of an eclectic mix than how we've talked about him here on the show.
His filmmaking is wild. His history is wild. He would have another Best Picture nominee in the '60s with The Sand Pebbles, but he also directed Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Yeah,
Which I'm actually kind of a defender of. I don't think it's a great movie, but I'm kind of a defender of that one. The Haunting, The Day the Earth
Andromeda
Stood
Strain.
Still, the Andromeda Strain rules. That he's got a couple like what I guess are perceivably B level horror films here that I think are really intriguing. The Body Snatcher.
The Body Snatcher. Yep.
He's directed a lot of movies.
The Day the Earth Stood Still. That's
I
another
love that movie.
fascinating
It's been a
film.
while
Yeah,
since
I
I've
love that.
seen it, but I thought that was really good. There's
Yeah.
one here I know. It's a movie called The Setup that I know some of our fellow colleagues have talked about. I haven't seen it. So this might be a filmmaker that's primed for a movie series. He is a perfect
I think
candidate.
so. Yeah, I would love to get into Robert Wise, especially since we've now done some of his.
We've done two of his movies, so we've already gotten some, headway
Yeah.
here.
Absolutely.
Did you know that this movie was originally supposed to be directed by William Wyler?
No, but that would have been fascinating. That also could have been really interesting.
Yeah.
But Robert Wise, the composers and the composition, the song work here, extraordinary. How it all works cinematically. I would love to see this on the stage. I've never seen it on the stage, as we mentioned earlier. But cinematically, I do love how this film uses that music. Again, both as a musical movie, it is very diverting in that way, but there's also a thematic proponent to it as well. I love the way it repeats certain motifs. I think is really interesting. The melodies, of course, are extremely catchy. It truly is incredible how many numbers here are so prominent in the zeitgeist that again, you would know them even if you've never seen the movie. They're just so incredibly popular. Like it's wild. The soundtrack here.
They repeat themselves a lot too. This is weirdly a musical in the traditional sense, but also in the more like performative sense, kind of like it almost kind of sways back and forth between, something like West Side Story, which we talked about earlier, and then something like a John Carney movie, like Once. There's a bit of a pendulum happening here between both sides of this being a movie musical and a music movie, which I think is pretty intriguing, and yet it's very seamless. It's a very nicely balanced act.
It is. Yeah,
I love this movie. It's
so good.
Yeah, I think as
Yeah.
far as these Best Picture series that we've done so far, between the 40s and the 60s specifically, because that's all we've done, thus far, the 40s, I feel like tells a more consistent story, historically speaking, between what movies were chosen to win and
Mhm.
why, just given the circumstances of what America was going through in the 1940s and World War II playing a huge part in that. But the quality of the 1960s thus far, 6 movies in, at least 3 of them get a 5 out of 5 on Letterboxd for me.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I've loved this series so far. I mean, The Apartment, West Side, Lawrence, and now The Sound of Music, all timers as far as I'm concerned.
Mhm,
Incredible, incredible Best Picture winners. Yeah. And that's why
mhm,
I was excited to dig into the 60s because, it had been a few years since I had seen many of those movies
mhm.
outside of Lawrence of Arabia. That one I had seen in recent
Yeah.
years. But West Side Story, The Apartment, The Sound of Music, I was dying to revisit those. And some of
Mhm.
these will end up being new watches for me. And we've covered even a couple of those. Tom Jones, My Fair Lady, those were first time watches. And I didn't love those as much, but I
Mhm.
am extremely happy that these other iconic movies that I already loved have really stood up in many regards. And The Sound of Music, again, it's not just the iconic music. You could argue it's outside of Lawrence of Arabia because that's on a stratosphere of its own. But
That invented a new level.
it invented a new
It's
level. It's
weird
on
to say,
another
like,
planet.
it is clearly the best of these in this decade.
Well, I
I
was going to say specifically the craft work. When you're
Yeah.
looking at costumes coupled with camera work, interiors, exteriors, the choreography of it, you couple that with the performances at the core of this, the urgency dramatically that we get at the end of the film, the craft work to The Sound of Music is just absurd. It's
Yeah.
really, really great. And then you combine all of that with everything else we've been talking about in terms of its thematic prowess, the storytelling, the character work. It's a great movie. I don't care how schmaltzy it is. In this case, the schmaltz I think is welcomed. It's a
Handles it well.
compliment to the
Yeah.
concoction. Yes, it works for this movie,
Yeah.
and everything else is so stinking glorious. It's absolutely fantastic. It is one of the best films of this decade, for
Oh, yeah.
sure.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah,
It's quite magical stuff. Yeah. I
yeah,
I I
yeah.
don't want I don't wanna reveal this too soon because we obviously have, I guess, yeah, we have 4 more films to get to in this Best Picture series of the 1960s.
Yeah.
Um, I mentioned this earlier. I feel like Lawrence of Arabia is and probably will remain the quote unquote best of these. It's possible The Sound of Music ends up actually being my favorite, which I think is a very different thing. Um,
Mhm.
I, yeah, I love this one. That's
I
all I'll say
mean,
about it.
it's funny that you say that because I was actually talking with my wife about this the other day because we actually watched this together.
Okay.
And I don't know, maybe that had something to do with it because we don't
Maybe. I
really
mean,
get to watch movies much
I
anymore.
watch this with my wife as well, so I guess that does say something about our conversation here.
Yeah, I don't know because I sadly don't get to watch movies with her all that often anymore.
Mhm.
But I could not stop thinking about this movie after we watched it. I could
Yeah.
not stop thinking about it. I loved it. I listened to the soundtrack like 16 times in a row. I just absolutely adored it. I was on a high. I thought it was great. Like I loved every second of it. And I cannot say enough good things about Julie Andrews here and her performance. It truly is stunning. And Christopher Plummer. I thought together
Mhm.
they were immaculate.
Aces. Aces.
Aces.
Honestly, one of the
100%.
best romances of its time
Oh
too.
my gosh, it's so good.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah, I know. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Yeah, Lawrence of Arabia will probably be the best of the decade, but as far as my favorite, I might be with you. We'll see on the other four. I don't want to get too far
Yeah.
ahead,
Yeah,
but
because I
I'm
remember
right there.
really loving Midnight Cowboy when I first saw that, so
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
looking
for
forward to that
sure.
one as well.
Same, yeah. And I look forward to giving that one another go as well.
Mhm.
But, yeah, very possible. And I don't know if I would have guessed that when we started the 60s some weeks ago, but here we are.
Yeah, yeah.
Here we
I'm
are. And
kinda with you. I like being surprised.
I do too. And I love West Side Story. Love The Apartment. Love Lawrence.
Mhm.
I don't know. There's something magical. There's something special. Sometimes it's just that lightning in a bottle. I don't know.
I don't know,
But it's
sometimes you
great.
just have
I love it.
the right actors playing their respective roles. I
Yeah.
feel like the same thing could be said about why I love Mary Poppins so much. Julie Andrews
Yeah.
is just on another level in this
She
decade.
just, yeah. Those two performances back to back. Are you kidding me? I mean,
That's illegal.
just
That's just
stupid.
illegal.
Yeah. Speaking of one of my favorite behind the scenes of The Sound of Music, in between takes, she would sing Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious to the children.
Oh, yeah, but they had no idea what it was because apparently they were filming this before Mary Poppins even came out.
Yeah. At least in Austria. It had come
Yeah.
out in the States, I think, but I don't think it had come out in Austria. So yeah, they weren't
It's hilarious.
familiar with it. But that is so funny that she would sing. Could you imagine when they finally did get that movie in Austria? Those kids lost their minds, I'm sure.
There are little tidbits about this movie as far as the trivia is concerned that I think are weirdly more charming than other pieces of trivia I see in other movies. Like the fact that when Julie Andrews first enters the Von Trapp household, she trips. That was
Yeah.
actually apparently a real accident. And Robert
Yeah,
Wise
I
just
heard
kept it in
that.
the movie because he thought that was a very natural response for Marie to have in that moment.
Yeah.
Little lucky accidents like that sometimes can make a movie.
It's good stuff. All right. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com.